Hello everyone, this is Pastor Chris Johnson, Associate Pastor at Zion Lutheran Church in Wausau, Wisconsin, also helping to serve at Bethany Lutheran Church in Anawa. And today I come to you with our weekly Bible study. We took a little hiatus in observance of Holy Week, and by all means, if you missed any part of Holy Week, we have all of that available on our YouTube account, Holy Monday through Easter Vigil. Not Good Friday. Good Friday was on the radio, and so you can go to our website to listen to the Good Friday, the Tre Ore 3-hour service, wonderful sermons from Pastor Jury and Pastor Pinzel, and so just some wonderful food for the soul in the midst of this time of pandemic. Before we took a little hiatus for Holy Week, we were in the prophet Habakkuk. We looked at, before that, Habakkuk chapters 1 and the first part of chapter 2. And Habakkuk, again, is laying out for us essentially how are the righteous to live by faith in God? How are God's righteous people, those who trust in Him, believe in Him, cling to Him for life and for salvation and for everything, how are the righteous to live by faith when they have nothing at all except God Himself? And so again, I think that's why Habakkuk is a very fitting book for this day and age, especially in time of pandemic where we are quarantined and we see some wonderful things from some people, but we also see some very unbecoming things of other people, whether it's people we know, people we're related to, people in power, positions of authority, public leaders, politicians, and so on and so forth. And so even though the world could go to pot, we still have God, and God is, again, as Habakkuk is also trying to point out, God is working out His good purposes for His glory. God uses unlikely channels through which He communicates His mercy, but also through which He communicates His judgment. And with Habakkuk, the big question that Habakkuk was wrestling with is how could God use a wicked nation to chastise and punish them, Israel, when Israel was the chosen people of God. Yes, Israel, Habakkuk admits in chapter 1, yes, we are full of sin, we are full of iniquity, we have unrighteous people, we have unrighteous leaders, we have unrighteous pastors, so to speak, we have unrighteous priests, false shepherds leading the flock. We've got all of that injustice in the political level, injustice on the daily level, in the marketplace. We have injustice all over. Yes, Lord, we know we are full of sin, we are full of iniquity, and we fully deserve to receive our comeuppance, because after all, that's the old covenant. If you obey, you will be blessed, and if you disobey, you will be cursed. And time again, Israel had shown that they will not obey. Another important thread in Habakkuk, not really named in Habakkuk, but is an important thread to keep in mind, is this notion of a faithful remnant. And so here we have the nation of Israel under the judgment of God, yet God will preserve His people through a faithful remnant. And so even though the judgment of God is coming to bear on the people of Israel, and many people are about to lose their lives in the siege of Jerusalem, which will happen 10, 15, maybe 20 years after the prophet Habakkuk is doing his work, even though all that's going to happen, that God's elect people will still persevere. Some who truly belong to Him, who are true Israelites, who are circumcised in the flesh but also circumcised in the heart, even though some of those people may lose their lives under the judgment of God, nevertheless they will be saved in the end, because they truly believe that God is the one true God, and He is the Savior, the deliverer, the one through whom the world was made, and the one through whom God will also save the world. And so there's a faithful remnant. We need to keep that in mind as well. But again, Habakkuk is getting us to the point of focusing in on how the righteous are to live by faith when we have lost everything, but we haven't lost God. We always have God. Even though we lose everything, we still have God. And in the chapter that we're looking at, the last part of chapter 2, verses 6 through 20, what we see in this section in Habakkuk is this section it's a number of woes. A woe is an Old Testament stock word for the prophets, by which God is pronouncing His judgment upon some persons or some group or some nation. Woe to you, Egypt! Woe to you, Syria, woe to you, Lebanon, woe to you, Babylon, the Chaldeans, and so on and so forth. And so almost all the prophets talk about some sort of woe against the people who are doing unholy things to the people of God. And of course, Babylon is one of those nations, but also, strangely, as we saw in chapters 1 and 2, Babylon is also the nation through whom God is bringing his judgment to bear on his own people. And so chapter 2, this part, verses 6 through 20, is a promise for the people of Israel, that faithful remnant, as they hang on for life and for salvation, as they cling to their Lord and God, that this evil that is coming to bear, this justly deserved evil that is coming to bear on them for the punishment of their corporate sins, but also individual sins, will have a limit. So evil will have its limit. And that's important to remember in time of pandemic, that this too shall pass. Yes, we're in the midst of it. We don't know how long it'll last. Maybe it'll be done in a couple of weeks. Some people think we're worrying way too much about things. Other people think we're not worrying enough. And so you've got this tension even in our own society of what's going on. But with this chapter 2, we have good news in that there is a limit to evil, to chastisement. So for whatever purpose God has ordained the pestilence, God is still working out his good purposes, and it will one day come to an end. Just like with the Babylonians, they didn't know how long they would be under this judgment, but this judgment against them would one day come to an end. And so the righteous live by faith, by trusting in God, even in the midst of all this awful stuff that is going around, that is going on. And so we have 5 woes in chapter 2. So let me read these for you and give you some brief thoughts and reflections on it. Starting at verse 6. Won't all of these take up a taunt against him with mockery and riddles about him? They will say, woe to him who amasses what is not his. How much longer? And loads himself with goods taken in pledge. Won't your creditors suddenly arise, and those who disturb you wake up? Then you will become spoil for them, since you have plundered many nations. All the peoples who remain will plunder you, because of human bloodshed and violence against lands and cities and all who live in them. Woe to him who dishonestly makes wealth for his house, to place his nest on high, to escape the grasp of disaster. You have planned shame for your house by wiping out many peoples and sinning against your own self. For the stones will cry out from the wall, and the rafters will answer them from the woodwork. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with injustice. Is it not from the Lord of armies that the peoples labor only to fuel the fire, and countries exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord's glory, as the water covers the sea. Woe to him who gives his neighbors drink, pouring out your wrath, and even making them drunk in order to look at their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace instead of glory. You also drink and expose your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will cover your glory. For your violence against Lebanon will overwhelm you. The destruction of animals will terrify you, because of your human bloodshed and violence against lands and cities and all who live in them. What use is a carved idol after its craftsman carves it? It is only a cast image, a teacher of lies, for the one who crafts its shape trusts in it, and makes idols that cannot speak. Woe to him who says to wood, wake up, or a mute stone, come alive, can it teach? Look, it may be plated with gold and silver, yet there is no breath in it at all. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let the whole earth be silent in his presence. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So here again in verses 6 through 20 of chapter 2, we see God working out his purposes and showing that there will be a limit to the evil and the reign of terror that Babylon will be bringing to Israel. And the 5 woes are directed against Babylon specifically for a number of sins. The first one, verses 6 through 8, is a woe directed, a woe of judgment because of their greed, that they're just amassing everything, they're hoarding everything, they can't have enough. And because they can't have enough, whether it is gold or toilet paper or fine fancy woods and or clothing, whatever it is. These Babylonians, because of their greed, which is a surface issue of a deeper symptom, which is idolatry. That's the last woe. But because they have all this stuff, they're ultimately going to lose it all. And this is a word of hope for God's faithful remnant as they wait for God to deliver them from this time. We hear that promise in verse 8, all the peoples who remain will plunder you, so the plunderer will become the plundered. And this is what we see eventually happening when Persia will run roughshod over Babylon a number of years later and destroying Babylon when they thought they were invincible. And what history shows us is that no nation is invincible. Whether it's the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans, we could even say our own nation. No nation is going to last for eternity. The only nation that will last forever is the people of God. God's faithful people, his faithful remnant that spans all tongues and all times and all nations and all peoples. That is the nation that will live forever. And so this woe is directing us to that too. The second woe that the Lord is speaking against Babylon is that they have acquired all of their greed and wealth through nefarious means, whether it's through dishonesty, like verse 9 says, or it's by simply violence, by being the big kid on the block, by simply being a bully. They have acquired all these things. And so again, the scriptures talk about wealth properly used in a way that can glorify God. But if wealth is improperly acquired, then the Lord has a problem with it. There's nothing wrong with working hard for what you have. But there is a problem if you've acquired what you have through sinful means and sinful channels. And this is what's happening with Babylon. A word of warning again to us today still, to not acquire wealth by dishonest means. The third woe is directed again towards Babylon for how they have built their empire on simply violence. That a civilization cannot last, God is saying, that is based purely on military might. Because there's always a bigger fish in the sea, right? There's always a bigger fish in the sea that will swallow you up. And so to have the basis of your civilization on military might and prowess, having the best chariots, the best swords, the best shields, the best armor, whatever it is, that is not going to. That's a false sense of security. You could have the best army, but if you don't have good leadership, what good does having the best stuff do you? And so God puts Babylon in their place and gives hope to the people of God by reminding the people of God in verse 14 that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord's glory, not the glory of Babylon. They will lose what glory they think they have. It will be all washed away, and God's glory is going to fill the world as it already does, but one day all people will know and come to believe that God is Lord, as we hear about, for example, in Philippians chapter 2, or the Great Commission in Matthew 28. Go out into all nations, teaching them, baptizing them, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And so God's glory will be known, and that is through the ministry and the mission of the church. The fourth woe is directed towards Babylon because of how they have enticed other nations. Say, look at us, look at our power, look at our wealth. Don't you want to be friends with us? I mean, it's good to be friends with the person that's in charge, right? To be with the big guy, the strong guy. Just be friends with us. And that will be turned against them eventually. And so what the prophet says is that there's a cup that is about to be poured out, which is another Old Testament stock image of God's wrath. And we see that in a number of places in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 25, for example, we see that in Revelation with the bowls of wrath, Revelation 16. And so this notion of wrath being poured out will come upon Babylon for all that they have done, how they have been greedy, how they have acquired their wealth, how they've been using their power to bully people around, how they've been using their power to acquire even more power and fleecing people of what little power that they thought they had. And all of that is undergirded by the fifth woe, verse 19, is because of their idolatry. Because they don't believe in the one true God. This is why they're following after all sorts of other false gods, after the false gods of health and wealth and power and so on and so forth. And because they don't have the one true God, ultimately they're going to lose it all. Everything is going to be taken from them that God has permitted them and allowed them to have for this moment in history. God allows this to happen. This is the great struggle in chapters 1 and 2. But all that they have will be taken away because they are first and foremostly an idolatrous nation. A word of warning for any nation that is full of idolatry. And again, when it comes to moments of great affliction, when it comes to moments of great tension, that's when you see the gods that the people will follow. Whether it's with our pandemic and people going to the store and buying all sorts of stuff that they don't need, and that prohibits other people from having what they do need. And so we've got these great gods of health and wealth and selfishness and greed, and also lots of pride in our nation that's kind of being unearthed because of this pestilence. We see it in the upper layers of society. We see it in individuals. And so this time has certainly brought out the worst in a number of people. And again, it just goes to show that these are the gods to whom people will trust in. If they don't live by faith in the one true God, then they will live by faith in the God that they believe in and they trust in, whether it's money or power or violence or whatever it is. And so Habakkuk, again, is directing us that the righteous shall live by faith. Verse 20, let the whole earth be silent in his presence. Right? As we wait for God to work out his good purposes, we trust and we trust in faith. We have faith in God that he is doing what he needs to do even in this time, that he has allowed these things to happen, whether it's Babylon coming into Israel or allowing a pestilence to happen. We don't know why God has done this, but we know that God is directing this and using this moment in history ultimately for his glory. And again, that's how the righteous live by faith. We know that God is doing something good, something wonderful, but we don't see it now. We might not see it for decades, but God is still doing something good through the channels and things that we see going on in history. And in our moment of history with the pandemic, we trust and we wait and we cling to Christ for life and salvation as God works out his good purposes even now. So God be with you as you dig into Habakkuk chapter 2. We'll look at part of chapter 3, maybe all of chapter 3 next week. I haven't decided. But may God be with you, and may God's peace be with you, the peace of the risen Lord Jesus Christ, who gives us hope that even in the midst of death, life comes, that God's life has won the victory and gives that life to all of his faithful people. May God be with you until we meet again. Peace be with you.